Meow! I'm Huples cat. What happens when we go to war? In 1917, the United States of America declared war on Germany after a Senate vote that wasn't unanimous but was close to it. Woodrow Wilson, the president, may have said, "Once lead this people into war and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance." However, the rest of this attributed quote is actually quite interesting. Once lead this people into war and they will forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fibre of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street.
Some shouting for war, some crying for peace. Inside the White House, President Woodrow Wilson conferred with advisors, then signed the proclamation of war against Germany. The men present here are gone.
Over the previous 100 years, the United States of America had welcomed immigrants from across the world, mostly from Europe. The American population in 1917 was 103 million people, of which 6 million were ethnic German immigrants.
Immediately after the U.S. had declared war, local governments, civic organizations, and even ordinary citizens began an attack on German Americans and their culture.
There are children who are instructed by their teachers to cut German songs out of the music books that they use in their classrooms. There is a public Stein-breaking fest at one point to keep people from drinking German beer. There's even in one town in Ohio a really gruesome slaughter of German dog breeds. But it's important not to let these ridiculous stories to overshadow what is really a wholesale destruction of an ethnic culture in the United States.
Germans were pressured to stop playing German music, to stop going to German plays. And when I say Germans, I mean German Americans whose ancestors might have been in this country since before the Revolution.
The anti-German hysteria even extended to the federal government. The CPI published an article with tips on how to identify people who were pro-German. The president issued a decree that made any German living in the United States register as an enemy alien. Almost 500,000 men and women were photographed, fingerprinted, and interrogated about their loyalty to the United States.
Now merely having a German-sounding name was a sign of evil. 6% of the country, almost overnight, had become other.
The program was administered by a 22-year-old member of the Department of Justice, J. Edgar Hoover. By the fall, a new series of camps capable of housing thousands of people had sprung up in Utah, Georgia, and North Carolina, not to train new recruits, but to imprison anyone that the government considered a threat to its security.
There was tremendous pressure on new immigrants to conform, to have American flags, to sing American songs. We welcomed you here. Now you're here, you're with us, and you're only with us.
The surname Koenig was common. It suddenly disappeared overnight and became king. Nothing's more traditionally American than the Frankfurter. It's often said that World War I caused the Frankfurter to be called the hot dog. This isn't actually true. What is true is merely speaking German, or something that sounded German, was extremely dangerous. A Methodist minister said it was the Christian duty of Americans to decorate convenient lampposts with German spies and agents of the Kaiser, native or foreign born. A pastor was tarred and feathered in Minnesota purely because he'd been heard praying in German with a dying woman. This erasure of culture because of war still happens today. Hate speech is never free speech, and hate speech, especially from pastors and politicians, often leads to violence. In 2022 and 2023, we see the same old stuff again and again. The stuff we saw in every war we've ever had. And we see the same sad effects. Politicians who have no policies that appeal to the populace really love wars. Nothing like a good war to silence their critics and decrease freedom, and to take the spotlight off their incompetence as politicians. When America entered the war in 1917, one of its main targets for repression was unions, trade unions. Of course, that had absolutely nothing to do with the Kaiser or Germany or the Axis. It had everything to do with the power elite concerned in 1917 that they too might find themselves overthrown by the workers. Giving the people a scapegoat, giving the people an object to blame, especially if it's a minority that stands out, is a really great political move. It works very, very well, unless you're a politician in that minority.
The FBI came and arrested my future-in-law father, who was a very gentle Buddhist minister. He was incarcerated and taken away. The business people who owned stores were picked up, and labor union leaders were also picked up. They were all sent to Honolulu camp. From there, they were sent to Sand Island. From Sand Island, they were sent to relocation camps on the mainland.
Well, I felt betrayed. I mean, you know, here I am an American citizen, and then they made me wear, my sister, my brother, and I all had to wear a black badge.
We put away all the scrolls of calligraphy, photos of relatives in Japan that were on our walls or on our cabinets.
My dad was sent to Santa Fe, and I think this was something that all of the inmates were asked to do. They wrote home, my dad wrote home asking us whether we would like to join him on the mainland or go back to Japan. I mean, this was the choice.
It was January 19, 1942. Early in the morning at 3 o'clock, our commander roused us all out of our pup tents, and he had to make a sorrowful announcement that he said, you know, all cadets of Japanese ancestry are going to be discharged. So that was the traumatic termination of our first military service rendered during the war.
I think hating any group's a bad idea. I also think blaming any particular group's a bad idea. I do know that invading other countries is a really bad idea, and yet we humans do this over and over and over with the same result. Of course, in every war, if there's time allowing, the population, generally speaking, would rather avoid the war. There is a minority who want war because they're insane. During the Iraq War, millions of people around the world told their leaders quite clearly the case against Saddam was not proven and they should not attack. They, of course, ignored them and attacked. We're told to be happy that we've killed people. We're told to question anybody on the left. We cover the war almost as if it's entertainment. We're told repeatedly, you're either for your country or you're against it. There is no middle ground. Of course, the other side sees the same thing just the same way. In war after war, small, medium or large, it's the same playbook. You other the other people, you treat people very badly, you tell your people you have to fight for us because otherwise it's all over, and you attack the unions and you attack free speech, and you keep that in place afterwards. Immediately after 9/11, it became very fashionable to hate Arabs, and specifically Muslims. 22 years later, this stirring up of hatred remains.
Salman Azam grew up in Staten Island in New York City. He says 9/11 was a defining moment in his life.
He went to funerals for friends' parents who worked in the World Trade Center or who were firefighters or police officers. So it was a very emotional time.
Not only as an American, but also as a Muslim.
I walked outside the mosque one day and I remember a truck driving by telling me, like, go back to where you came from. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I was born in Brooklyn. You know, I'm just as American as any one of you.
Muslims and people of Arab and South Asian descent in America also face racial profiling by law enforcement. Raina Jaber says at times she felt singled out at airports.
I used to always get patted down. They'd be like, oh, you were randomly selected. I would also be randomly selected while I'm waiting to get on the plane.
An ABC News review of FBI hate crime data from the past 2 decades found that the number of anti-Muslim incidents spiked nationwide following September 11th, and they have never returned to pre-2001 levels.
When it comes to Muslims, there was still that understanding that somehow all of us, individual, ordinary Muslims, are an extension of that aberrational, bizarre behavior that none of us can relate to or even understand. That is a double standard, and I think we're beginning to understand that that double standard exists.
Azam says many Muslim Americans lost their lives on 9/11, and many helped in the city's recovery, including his dad.
By September of 2001, you'd hope people had developed enough to be able to be more rational about these types of events. And yet, white mass murderers remain an aberration, whilst Muslim or black mass murderers are representative of something wrong with their own culture. The hypocrisy is startling.
At 8:57 a.m., security cameras at the Regency Tower apartment building, a few blocks west of the Murrah building, catch the Ryder truck parked across the street. Investigators surmise this is when McVeigh lights the first fuse.
Much of Canada's support for Ukraine has been in the form of sanctions against Russia, economic measures targeting Russian oligarchs, institutions, and government officials. But CBC News has learned the sanctions are also freezing assets for people with no ties whatsoever to Vladimir Putin.
In Illinois, Robert Prager was attacked by a mob and murdered. The murderers held United States flags at their trial and were acquitted by the jury in 45 minutes. Robert Prager was the only foreign national to be killed during the First World War, but many national Americans were killed during the First World War by Americans.
On June 8, 1917, fire caused by a faulty electric cable broke out in the spec shaft. Before it was over, 164 men were killed by suffocation. Compensation to families was $4,000 for the life of each miner. The tragedy was one of the most disastrous in the history of all quartz mining. The bloodiest date in Butte labor history is August 1st, 1917. The industrial workers of the world were making headway organizing miners in wake of the speculator fire. Top organizer was Frank Little. Early in the morning of August 1st, 1917, gunmen broke into Little's room, tied him behind an automobile, and dragged him 2 miles down Butte Hill to the flats. His body was left hanging from a railroad trestle. Little's funeral was one of the largest ever held in Butte. There were 2,500 participants. Butte is a city of death. Butte is not quite 100 years old, yet her cemeteries contain far more headstones than her present population. The price paid in human lives for the 300 million tons of copper ore that have been torn from the stubborn Montana rock has been incredibly high.
The IWW was commonly called the Wobblies, or I Will Not Work.
What's your name?
Sam Scarlett.
What's your religion?
The IWW.
That ain't no religion.
The only one I got.
Are you a citizen? No, I'm an industrial worker of the world.
The one who is a working man could not be denied membership for any reason, as long as he was an actual wage worker, race, creed, color, for any
sex.
Reason, sex, whatever.
Industrial workers of the world work, good wages, and respect. That's what they wanted for the workers. To be people, not nobody.
The heat was 110 to 112 to 114 degrees temperature out in the sun. And you could look across the plains and see a freight train from miles away.
Roosevelt called the Wobblies unhung traders. It's a pretty nasty thing to say. If you strike for better conditions of labour, you are a traitor. In Tulsa, many were tarred and feathered. Some of the National Guard and corporate detectives hired across America killed dozens of IWW workers.
His humorous quotes are the writing on the walls at the Whitley County Historical Museum, which is his former home in Columbia City.
What this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar. There were 2 brothers. One went to sea, one became vice president, and neither was ever heard from again. I was the Wilson administration's spare tire only to be used in case of emergency.
Frank Little organised the Wobblies. He was lynched. The Vice President of the United States, Thomas Marshall, said this when he heard that Little had been murdered. A little hanging goes a long way. Thanks for watching. If you like this, give me a thumbs up, give me a comment. If you want to send me your firstborn child and subscribe, feel free. To summarise, Canada or America goes to war again, a proper war. I expect the same playbook. Already in Canada, ethnic Russian Canadians are invisible, never on TV, never have their viewpoint put forward. Ethnic Ukrainians who are in Canada cover our mass media continually.
In this picture taken with his unit, which was later accused of committing war crimes, you can see Hunker standing in the middle of the back row.
We're still using the victims of violence to push the idea of supporting violence. It is complicated. War is sometimes inevitable. Most wars are not inevitable. Most wars could have been stopped. Most wars should have been negotiated. The fact that we elect or have appointed leaders who are not interested in peace but their own political power is one of the major causes of war. On an individual level, try not to hate anybody. If Russia nukes New York, it wasn't the Russian people that did it, it was their leadership, and vice versa. Doodles. This is a Wolfie's Hamlet production 2023. It's often said the Frankfurter became the hot dog. It's often said World War One caused the hot dog to be... It's often said that World War One called the...